There are battles that echo through eternity, not for their strategic importance, but for what they reveal about the human spirit when faced with impossible odds. In the summer of 480 BC, at a narrow coastal pass the Greeks called the Hot Gates, the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance as the largest army the world had ever seen crashed against a handful of defenders who refused to yield. History remembers the 300 Spartans and their warrior king Leonidas, but it has largely forgotten the 700 men from the small city of Thespiae who chose to stand and die beside them. Not because their laws demanded it, not because their culture glorified death in battle, but simply because abandoning their allies was unthinkable. These forgotten warriors proved that courage is not the monopoly of any single people, and that sometimes the greatest heroism comes not from those trained for war, but from ordinary citizens who discover extraordinary depths within themselves when everything they cherish stands threatened. The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow pass of Thermopylae as Demetrios of Thespiae adjusted the grip on his spear and studied the horizon where Persian dust clouds had been growing larger for 3 days. At 25, he was neither the youngest nor the oldest among the 700 hoplites his city had sent to join the Greek alliance. But his steady hands and calm demeanor had earned him respect among men who had left comfortable lives as farmers, potters, and merchants to face the greatest army ever assembled. "They say Xerxes has 1,000,000 men," whispered Aristophanes, a potter whose calloused fingers now gripped an ash spear instead of clay. His voice carried the tremor of a man trying to comprehend numbers that exceeded human understanding. "Ships that blacken the sea, cavalry that raises dust clouds like thunderstorms, archers so numerous their arrows will blot out the sun." Demetrios nodded grimly, studying the Spartan positions ahead of them, where King Leonidas and his 300 elite warriors prepared their weapons with the methodical calm of professional soldiers. The Spartans moved with an economy of motion that spoke of lifelong training, their bronze armor gleaming like liquid fire in the morning light. But what struck Demetrios most powerfully was not their equipment or bearing. It was the casual way they discussed probable death as if it were no more significant than the weather. 1,000,000 men, he repeated thoughtfully, calculating the impossible mathematics of their situation, against 7,000 Greeks, most of whom have never seen a battle larger than border disputes with neighboring cities. "Do you think we can hold them?" asked Philippos, a young farmer whose broad shoulders and work-hardened frame made him valuable in the phalanx formation that would be their primary weapon against Persian infantry. His question carried no fear, only the practical curiosity of a man who needed to understand his situation in order to respond appropriately. Demetrios considered the question carefully, studying the terrain that had been chosen for this desperate stand. The pass of Thermopylae was perhaps 50 meters wide at its narrowest point, flanked by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. It was ideal defensive ground that would prevent the Persians from using their overwhelming numerical superiority effectively, forcing them to attack frontally against prepared positions held by heavily armed hoplites whose training and equipment were superior to anything the Persian Empire could field. "We can hold them here," he said finally, his voice carrying conviction that surprised him. "The pass negates their numbers. Our armor is superior to theirs, and our phalanx formation is specifically designed to defeat the kind of frontal assault they'll be forced to make." What he did not say, but what every man present understood, was that holding the pass and surviving it were very different things. Even if they could repel Persian attacks indefinitely, their position would become untenable when enemy forces found alternative routes around the mountains. The defense of Thermopylae was always intended to be temporary, designed to buy time for the main Greek forces to prepare defensive positions further south. "The Spartans seem confident," observed Nicodemus, a merchant whose peacetime travels had given him unusual insight into military affairs. "I've heard their laws forbid retreat under any circumstances. They'll fight here until every man is dead, rather than abandon their positions. The observation crystallized something that had been troubling Demetrios since the Thespian contingent arrived at Thermopylae 3 days earlier. The Spartans were bound by cultural and legal obligations that made retreat impossible regardless of tactical circumstances. But the Thespian hoplites had no such constraints. They were citizen soldiers who could withdraw with honor if military necessity demanded it. "What about us?" Philippos asked, voicing the question that occupied every non-Spartan mind in the Greek camp. "If this position becomes untenable, are we obligated to die here, or do we fall back to fight another day?" It was a question that would define not just their immediate tactical situation, but their understanding of duty, loyalty, and the meaning of allied cooperation in the face of existential threat. Demetrios found himself grappling with concepts that had no clear answers in previous military experience. The sound of marching feet interrupted their discussion as Persian scouts appeared at the far end of the pass, their colorful uniforms and exotic equipment marking them as advance elements of the vast army that was approaching from the north. Through his bronze shield, polished to mirror brightness, Demetrios could see reflected, distorted images of enemy soldiers who moved with professional competence, despite serving a cause he considered tyrannical. "Contact front," called out Demophilos, the Thespian commander whose aristocratic bearing concealed the soul of a warrior poet. "Form phalanx by companies. Remember, we're fighting not just for Greece, but for the principle that free men cannot be conquered by any tyrant, regardless of the size of his army." The Greek formation that assembled in the narrow pass represented something unprecedented in ancient warfare, a truly international alliance of city-states that had set aside their usual conflicts to face a common enemy. Spartans held the center with their characteristic discipline, while Thespians, Mantineans, and other allies formed the wings in a defensive line that stretched across the entire width of the pass. As Persian forces advanced within spear range, Demetrios found himself studying individual enemy faces, recognizing expressions that mirrored his own mixture of determination and apprehension. These were professional soldiers, following orders from commanders who had successfully conquered most of the known world. They possessed superior numbers, adequate equipment, and experience gained through campaigns that had eliminated armies larger than the entire Greek force at Thermopylae. "Steady, lads," Demophilos called, his voice carrying clearly across the Thespian ranks. "Let them come to us. Our strength is in formation discipline and superior armor. We hold the line until ordered otherwise." The first Persian attack began with a flight of arrows so dense that it seemed to darken the sky, followed by the characteristic war cry of infantry advancing at the run. Demetrios crouched behind his hoplon shield, feeling arrow points strike bronze with sounds like hail on a metal roof, while calculating angles and distances for the spearwork that would begin when enemy forces reached the Greek line. "Here they come!" Aristophanes shouted, his potter's precision translated into the rhythm of thrust and recovery that characterized phalanx combat. Persian infantry crashed into the Greek formation like a wave against rocks, their initial impact absorbed by shields and armor that had been specifically designed to withstand such assaults. The fighting that followed was unlike anything Demetrios had experienced during training exercises or minor border conflicts with rival city-states. Persian soldiers demonstrated courage and skill that commanded respect even from enemies, pressing their attacks despite casualties that would have broken less disciplined forces. But their equipment and tactics were optimized for different types of warfare, leaving them at a severe disadvantage when facing heavy infantry in prepared positions. "Push forward," Demophilos commanded, and the Thespian section of the phalanx advanced in perfect unison, their spear points creating a hedge of bronze that Persian forces could neither penetrate nor avoid. Enemy soldiers fell in windows, their lighter armor providing inadequate protection against ash spearheads that were driven by the combined strength of men who had spent their lives in physical labor. But what struck Demetrios most profoundly as the battle developed was not the tactical effectiveness of Greek defensive methods, but the psychological impact of facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reserves. For every Persian soldier that fell, 2 more appeared to take his place, advancing with the same determination and meeting the same fate with mechanical regularity. "How long can they keep this up?" Philippos gasped during a brief lull as Persian forces reorganized for another assault. Blood ran from a shallow cut on his forehead where an enemy spear point had found the gap between helmet and cheek guard, but his grip on his weapons remained steady. "As long as necessary," Demetrios replied, though privately he was calculating the mathematics of attrition that seemed to favor Persian strategy. Each attack cost the defenders casualties they could not replace, while enemy losses were absorbed by reserves that appeared inexhaustible. The second Persian assault was preceded by a bombardment of javelins that forced Greek soldiers to take cover behind their shields, while enemy infantry advanced across ground that was now carpeted with the bodies of their comrades. Demetrios watched Persian officers directing their troops with professional competence, adapting their tactics to counter Greek defensive methods through innovations that reflected experience gained from previous engagements. "Their learning," observed Nicodemus, whose merchant's eye for detail had identified changes in Persian formation, an approach that suggested intelligent adaptation to battlefield conditions. "Each attack is better coordinated than the last. They're using our successes to improve their own methods." The observation was both encouraging and disturbing. Persian willingness to learn from failure demonstrated the kind of military professionalism that had built their empire, but it also suggested that Greek tactical advantages might diminish as enemy forces adapted to local conditions. The fighting continued throughout the afternoon, with Persian attacks growing more sophisticated as their commanders identified weaknesses in Greek defensive arrangements. Enemy forces began concentrating their efforts against specific sections of the line, attempting to create local breakthroughs that could be exploited by follow-up forces. But the phalanx system was designed to redistribute pressure across the entire formation, making such tactics less effective than they would have been against less disciplined opponents. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across a battlefield littered with Persian dead, Demetrios found himself reflecting on the nature of courage and the meaning of sacrifice. The Thespian hoplites had acquitted themselves with honor that matched anything achieved by their famous Spartan allies, demonstrating that citizen soldiers could fight professional armies to a standstill when they possessed adequate motivation and leadership. "First day goes to us," Thermopylae announced, as Persian forces withdrew to reorganize and treat their wounded. "But don't mistake tactical success for strategic victory. Xerxes has reserves we cannot imagine, and time is on his side. Every hour we delay him here is an hour that Greek forces in the south can use to prepare defensive positions." That evening, as cook fires dotted the Greek camp and men shared food that might be their last meal, Demetrios found himself in conversation with Alexios, a Spartan warrior whose scarred armor testified to years of combat experience. Despite the cultural differences that normally kept Spartans aloof from their allies, the shared dangers of Thermopylae had created bonds that transcended traditional boundaries. "Your men fought well today," Alexios said, with the grudging respect that Spartans reserved for warriors who had proven themselves in combat. "Better than I expected from citizen soldiers with limited military training." "We fight for the same cause," Demetrios replied diplomatically, though privately he was pleased by recognition from soldiers whose military reputation was legendary throughout the Greek world. "Persian tyranny threatens all of us equally, regardless of our individual city-states." "That's where you're wrong," Alexios said quietly, his voice carrying implications that chilled Demetrios despite the warmth of the evening fire. "Spartans fight because our laws require it, because retreat would bring dishonor that extends to our families and descendants. But you Thespians could withdraw tomorrow with no loss of honor, claiming that strategic necessity overrode tactical commitments." The observation forced Demetrios to confront questions he had been avoiding since the battle began. What obligations did Thespian soldiers owe to allies whose cultural values differed fundamentally from their own? Was honor defined by individual city-states, or did it transcend political boundaries when facing common enemies? "And if we withdrew," he asked, needing to understand the implications of decisions that might be forced on them by circumstances beyond their control. "Then Spartans would die alone, as our laws require," Alexios replied, with matter-of-fact acceptance that spoke of a lifelong preparation for such possibilities. "We would hold this pass until every man was dead, because that is what Sparta demands of her sons." The second day of fighting began with a Persian assault that demonstrated lessons learned from the previous day's failures. Enemy forces advanced in smaller, more maneuverable units that could probe for weaknesses without committing their entire strength to frontal attacks that had proven so costly. Archers provided covering fire, while infantry maneuvered for flanking attacks that would have been impossible in the narrow confines of the pass. "They're getting smarter," Philippos observed, as Persian tactics evolved in real time, adapting to Greek defensive methods with a flexibility that spoke of professional military education. "Won't be long before they find ways to neutralize our advantages." The fighting that day was more intense than anything they had experienced, with Persian forces pressing their attacks with desperate determination that suggested external pressure from commanders who could not afford prolonged delays. Demetrios found himself thrust and parry in a deadly dance that reduced warfare to its most elemental components: strength against strength, will against will, bronze against bronze. During a brief respite between attacks, a runner arrived from the Phocian guards who had been stationed on the mountain path that flanked the pass. His message was brief but catastrophic. Persian forces had found the goat track that led around the mountains, and enemy troops were already descending toward the Greek rear. "We're surrounded," Thermopylae announced to the Thespian officers with calm that belied the gravity of their situation. "Persian immortals are moving to cut off our retreat. Within hours, we'll be attacked from both front and rear simultaneously." The tactical implications were clear and devastating. The Greek position at Thermopylae had been based on controlling a single narrow passage that prevented Persian numerical superiority from being decisive. But if enemy forces could attack from multiple directions, the phalanx formation would become untenable, and Greek resistance would collapse within minutes. "King Leonidas has called a council of war," Thermopylae continued. "All contingent commanders are to report immediately to discuss our response to this development." The council of war that assembled in Leonidas's tent was unlike any military conference in Greek history. Representatives from half a dozen city-states faced a decision that would define not just their immediate fate, but their understanding of duty and honor when confronted with impossible circumstances. "Gentlemen," Leonidas began with the austere dignity that had made him legendary among his own people, "Persian forces will complete their encirclement within hours. Our position here is no longer tenable from a tactical standpoint. Most of you have the option of withdrawing your forces to defensive positions further south, where they can continue to serve the Greek cause." The unspoken implication was clear. The Spartans had no such option. Their laws and culture demanded that they remain at Thermopylae regardless of tactical circumstances, fighting until every man was dead, rather than abandoning positions they had been ordered to hold. "What are the prospects for successful withdrawal?" asked the Mantinean commander, voicing the practical question that occupied every non-Spartan mind present. "Fair, if executed immediately," Leonidas replied honestly. "Persian forces are not yet in position to prevent organized retreat. But delay will make evacuation increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. Demetrios listened to the tactical discussion with growing awareness that the Thespian contingent faced a choice that would define their city's honor for generations. They could withdraw with full military justification, preserving 700 trained soldiers for future battles against Persian forces. Or they could remain with their Spartan allies, facing certain death for no clear tactical advantage. "The Thespians will remain," Thermopylae announced quietly, his words dropping into the council tent like stones into still water. "We came here to fight beside our allies, against Persian tyranny. Abandoning that commitment because circumstances have become difficult would make a mockery of everything we claim to believe." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of Persian forces preparing for what they assumed would be their final assault. Demetrios felt something shift inside him as he realized that his city-state had just committed to collective suicide based on principle rather than tactical necessity. "You understand what this means?" Leonidas asked, his voice carrying respect that approached reverence. "There will be no glory in this, no songs sung about your courage. You will die here for no reason except loyalty to allies who cannot repay your sacrifice." "Some things matter more than survival," Thermopylae replied with simple dignity that silenced further discussion. "If Thespiae cannot stand by her friends when they need her most, then we are not worthy of freedom anyway." As dawn broke on the third day, the remaining Greek force had been reduced to perhaps 1,400 men, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and a handful of Thebans who had been detained as hostages rather than volunteers. They formed a final phalanx in the widest part of the pass, determined to inflict maximum casualties on Persian forces before their inevitable annihilation. Today we make our stand not just as Spartans or Thespians, but as free Greeks who refuse to bow to tyranny. Leonidas addressed the combined force with words that would echo through history. "We fight not for victory. That is no longer possible, but for the principle that some things are worth dying for." The final battle began with a Persian assault that seemed to involve half the known world. Enemy forces attacked from every direction simultaneously, their arrows so numerous that they did indeed block out the sun, while infantry pressed forward with desperate determination that reflected their own commanders' impatience with prolonged delays. Demetrios found himself fighting beside Alexios, the Spartan warrior with whom he had shared conversation around the campfire. Their spears working in perfect coordination despite cultural differences that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier. In the crucible of final battle, such distinctions had become meaningless compared to the bond between men who faced death together. "For Greece!" Aristophanes shouted, his potter's hands wielding bronze with deadly precision as Persian forces broke against their line like waves against rocks. But waves, given sufficient time and force, could wear away any rock, and Persian resources seemed as inexhaustible as the sea itself. One by one, Greek soldiers fell to arrows, spears, and the accumulated exhaustion of fighting against impossible odds. Demetrios watched Philippos die with a Persian arrow in his throat, his young face showing surprise rather than pain as life left his eyes. Nicodemus fell moments later, his merchant's curiosity about foreign lands finally satisfied in the most permanent way possible. When Leonidas himself was struck down by Persian archers, the battle devolved into a desperate struggle over his body that demonstrated the honor codes that governed ancient warfare. Greeks and Persians died in equal numbers as each side attempted to claim or deny possession of the fallen king, their sacrifice transforming military necessity into something approaching religious ritual. As the circle of surviving defenders grew smaller, Demetrios found himself thinking not about the glory or futility of their last stand, but about the choice that had brought him to this place. The Thespians had not been forced to remain at Thermopylae by law or cultural tradition. They had chosen to stay because abandoning allies was unthinkable to men who valued loyalty above survival. "No surrender," Demophiles called out with his dying breath, struck down by a Persian spear that found the gap in his armor. Around him, the last Thespian hoplites fell one by one, their bronze shields forming a wall of dead that testified to courage that needed no songs or monuments to validate its worth. As Persian arrows finally found their mark, Demetrios felt oddly peaceful in his final moments. He had lived to see ordinary citizens prove themselves equal to professional warriors when fundamental values were at stake. The forgotten warriors of Thermopylae had demonstrated that heroism was not the monopoly of any single culture or city-state, but a universal human capacity that emerged when people chose principle over survival. The Battle of Thermopylae ended with total Persian victory that felt like defeat to everyone who witnessed it. Xerxes had lost more men capturing a small mountain pass than some of his generals had casualties in conquering entire kingdoms. The Greek dead lay in neat rows where they had fallen, their formation intact even in death, testimony to discipline that had never wavered despite impossible circumstances. But perhaps most remarkably, the Persian soldiers who had finally overrun the Greek position showed unprecedented respect for enemies who had fought with such courage. Instead of mutilating bodies or destroying equipment, as was customary after capturing defensive positions, they arranged the Greek dead with honor and marked the battlefield with monuments that acknowledged the extraordinary nature of what they had witnessed. 24 centuries later, tourists visiting the site of ancient Thermopylae find monuments to King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans whose sacrifice has been immortalized in countless books, films, and works of art. But if they search carefully, they can also find a smaller memorial dedicated to the 700 men of Thespiae who chose to die beside their allies simply because loyalty demanded it. The inscription, weathered by millennia but still legible, bears no heroic poetry or inspiring rhetoric. It simply states, "Here lie 700 citizens of Thespiae, who stayed when they could have left, and died when they could have lived, because some things matter more than survival." History may have forgotten their names, but their example endures, proof that the greatest heroism often comes not from those trained for war, but from ordinary people who discover extraordinary courage when everything they value stands threatened. The forgotten warriors of Thermopylae achieved immortality not through fame, but through the simple act of refusing to abandon their friends when friendship demanded the ultimate sacrifice.